a problem presents itself, I'm able to slow down and
Yes.
really analyze the situation. Instead of where I've seen some people who haven't had experience like that, they tend to speed up when things get harder and actually create more problems. Is that kind of the same thing when you have a warning light go off in your helicopter? Instead of panicking, you just kind of take a step back and look at it from a different perspective?
That's exactly right. Matter of fact, I used to brief when I still do. I say, hey, no fast hands in the cockpit, right? There's no gunslingers. There's no reason. And I think that the SEALs have that saying, it's slow is smooth, smooth is fast, right? And it really helps. We actually, in pilot training, when you're going through undergraduate pilot training, one of the things they do when they say, okay, you're flying along and you hear a loud bang, what do? Okay, first thing I do, hack the clock. Now, why do I hack the clock? Honestly, it doesn't matter if you hack the clock or not. Um, you know, the physical action of hacking the clock, you don't care what time it is. But what you're trying to do is you're giving yourself that opportunity to take a breath. So by hacking the clock, you're forcing, the muscle and everything to click, and now you get yourself in that crisis management mindset. All right, clock's hacked. Now what do? Aviate. All right, keep the aircraft upright. That's the first thing we're going to do. All right. As long as the aircraft's upright and it's flying, now I'm gonna start looking around and seeing what's going on, and then navigate's the next part, and then communicate. So aviate, navigate, communicate, and then the sub piece of the aviate is analyze the situation, take appropriate action. All right.
Welcome to the Leading with Vulnerability podcast. I'm your host, Yuma Barnett, and today my guest is Paul Mullis. Paul's a former Air Force pilot. Flew 53s, flew other fixed wing aircraft. When he got out of service, moved into the airline industry and flew there, and I think currently still does fly in the airline industry. We were talking before we came on the air about how much fear and anxiety I get when I talk about the 53, and especially when it pertains to fast roping. I'd rather do a nighttime halo wall locker jump instead of fast rope out of a 53 any day. I'm sure he's got some great stories. He's a first pilot that we've had on here. So I'm really interested to talk to him, hear about his time in service, why he chose to become a pilot, and then kind of his transition and what he still uses from his service time and his time as a pilot and his life as a husband and a father. But I'm not going to monopolize the time. I'm going to pass it off to him and let him introduce himself, and we'll get on with the conversation.
Well, thanks, you. I appreciate it. Happy to be here. So I'm from kind of the Midwest. Grew up first half of my life in Nebraska, Indiana, Georgia, and then when I was 12 years old, I moved over to Europe, where I wound up going to high school on an Air Force base in Germany, U.S. Air Force base in Germany, and I kind of got me interested in the service and joined it. That's where I first started thinking about joining the Air Force, and went out. Actually, did go to school. Went to the U.S. Air Force Academy out of high school. Went to pilot training. Then wound up flying UH-1s, MH-53s. After that, did staff work in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and also staff at Tampa, because I think I messed up the first time, so they made me do it twice. And then after that, I flew the U-28, so transitioned from rotary back to fixed wing, and did the U-28 until I retired. And then I did a little bit of contract work in King Airs and PC-12s. And then after that, I wound up getting hired by a major U.S. airline. I've been there for about the past 7 years, flying both the Airbus and the 737.
That's awesome. Thanks for your service. Thanks for flying us all to those targets and those fobs for all of those years. Much better than driving and or walking in some cases. Before we really get into your career and what you did as a pilot and what you're doing now, I'd just be curious to kick it off and what's your definition of vulnerability?
Vulnerability is, in my mind, it's the acknowledgement of your humanity. So we're all human and we're all fallible. And the vulnerability is the acknowledgement of that vulnerability, or that fallibility, I should say. Vulnerability is the acknowledgement that we are fallible. And that's the first part. And the second part is, okay, if you acknowledge that you're fallible, then what do you do about that? And so acknowledgement, and maybe it's the acknowledgement of that fallibility, and not hiding it, but yet seeking to mitigate that fallibility, I think is where the vulnerability piece comes in, particularly with respect to the podcast and the title of the podcast, Leading with Vulnerability. I think that it's knowing how to deal with that fallibility and still be an effective leader.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's what I love about when I ask people their definition. Everybody's got a little bit of a unique twist on it. They're all still kind of similar, but I think as leaders, we definitely need vulnerability and can use it to an advantage. So, did you grow up a military brat?
Not really. My dad was in the Air Force when I was born. He was stationed off at Air Force Base. He was a crew chief on T-39s, way back. And, so he was there for 2 years, or I was born like 2 years into his assignment. And then after, he finished up his 4-year stint, and it was like right in the kind of, Vietnam was going on in that time frame. And, he got orders. He actually got promoted and got orders to go to Vietnam. And my mom said, you know what, maybe it would be best if you stayed here, because they had just had my brother, who was 2 years younger than me. And that would have been 1972. So he had actually taken leave of absence from his job at General Motors to enlist in the Air Force, did that for 4 years. And he actually loved it. He used to talk about how he loved it, but out of the desire to be a good father and not leave us orphans, I think he decided to go on ahead and go back to working for General Motors. I kind of think that's something he may have actually regretted. I think he was happy with the decision, but you could tell he really enjoyed his time in the service. And so years later, when I was about 12 years old, we moved to Europe, and I went to school on an Air Force base. So I wasn't really a brat, but all my friends were brats, right? Like every single one of them. So, and both my dad served, my mom's dad served as well in World War II. So I come from a bit of a family business as far as it's going, as far as being in the military.
So is that what? So what drew you to the military? Why'd you end up enlisting in it? Was it your initial thought when you went in? You wanted to go into to fly to be a pilot, or what kind of led you down that path?
Yeah, I think I always knew I wanted to be a pilot even before I knew that I wanted to be a pilot. If that makes sense. Yeah, it's just something that always resonated with me. I used to say, like, when people say, "Hey, what do you want to be when you want to grow up?" And I used to say things like, what I thought the answer was, I want to be an anesthesiologist. I remember that. I didn't even know what an anesthesiologist was, but it sounded cool, right? But I think the truth of the matter is like, my dad said, even when I was a baby, both my parents were like, whenever you were a baby and a plane flew overhead, your head was up. It was looking to the sky. And there's a picture of me in his office. He's got me. He's holding me on the wing of a T-39, and that was like when I was like 6 months old or something. So I think I've always wanted to be a pilot. Just it didn't really. The path did not present itself until I was in high school, actually in junior high in Germany. And my best friend from 7th grade had a picture of the Air Force Academy chapel on his wall. And I remember looking at it was cool because there's like the chapel was there and all the spires, and there's these cadets and they're marching in front of it. I thought, man, that looks cool. I said, what is that? He said, oh, that's the Air Force Academy. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, it's like a college and you get to go there, but if you're pilot qualified, you get to be a pilot. And I was like, that's it. That sounds awesome. And I was like, well, is it expensive? He goes, no, it's free. And, which is a lie. No, it's not really free. Right. but you just don't pay in dollars.
Right.
And, But I was like, I'm done. That's awesome. And I went home and I told my dad, I'm like, hey, I want to go to the Air Force Academy. Of course, he knew what it was. He's like, yeah, that sounds awesome. And that was it. I mean, from that point on, my focus was laser front side on the Air Force Academy. Go to the Air Force Academy, be a pilot. And so that's kind of what led me down that path. And that's what started the chain of decisions I made that kind of got me sitting here today.
Yeah.
So.
And so I assume you did get accepted and went to the Air Force Academy.
I did, yeah.
And I'd be curious, what's that process look like when you go in there you want to be a pilot? Do you go into the Air Force Academy with that that you're kind of in that progression as you go through school? Or do you get to choose to fly helicopters? Do they choose for you? What's the Air Force Academy experience kind of like?
Yeah, it's kind of all the above. And this again, it's some of the other things that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So it does actually, you do get to pick sort of what you're going to do. I guess we'll start from, like, if you want to go to the Air Force Academy, and this is the same way with all service academies. First thing you have to do is you have to get a nomination, which is why it was kind of funny, because my buddy Steve was like, I'm going to go to the Air Force Academy. I was like, hey, me too. And that for two people, guys or girls, whatever, to go to a service academy out of the same high school is extremely rare, because you have to have a nomination from a congressional representative or a senator. So it's possible, but the odds are just kind of weird, because you've got, in a congressional district, you've got a whole bunch of people competing for that same nomination, because they only get effectively one per year. They're allowed to have 5 cadets in at any one time. Every representative and every senator is allowed to have 5 cadets in at one time, which basically means you get one per year and a spare. So it's kind of weird for two guys to be like, hey, I'm going to the academy. It's like, yeah, I'm going to go to. But the uniqueness of it is since we were military brats, we weren't in the same actual congressional district. So he wound up getting his nomination out of Nebraska, and I got mine out of Indiana. So that's how that works. And so you have to get a nomination, and then after you get a nomination, you have to get an appointment. And the appointment is, there's a scoring that goes on, and they look at the whole person concept. So they look at your grades, of course, is important. Not only are your grades important, though, then you've got your SATs or ACT scores, and then they look at everything else you're doing. Are you involved in any charities? Are you involved in student government? Are you an athlete? And all of these things, the answer kind of needs to be yes, at least to a certain extent, because they're looking for that well-rounded person. We're not looking for a bunch of super smart people alone, and we're not looking for a bunch of jocks. They want the whole person concept. So that if you get all of those, and you get a composite score, and you actually have to do an interview with an air officer, as air liaison officer, and all that gets put together, then you get racked and stacked, and then the academy decides whether or not they want to offer you an actual appointment. Yeah. And then from there, once you get into the academy, when I went through, as long as you were pilot qualified physically, you would get a pilot training slot. I don't believe that's the case anymore, because the slots aren't although actually right now they're having a pilot retention problem. That may be the case. That kind of ebbs and flows. If they've got a lot of pilots and they're not offering it. My class, they actually offered only, they initially said, hey, everyone's going to pilot training. And then afterwards they said, well, you're all going to go, but half of you are going to go now, and then the other half are going to go later, kind of thing. And the class of 93 behind me, they only let 270 of those guys go, and that was it. Oh. So it's kind of the needs of the military. And then as far as the decision to be a helicopter pilot, was not my first choice, because Top Gun came out when I was in high school.
Yes.
And so I want to be a fighter pilot, right? And I actually want to be a Navy fighter pilot, until I found out that there was a good chance that if I wasn't pilot qualified, or if things didn't go my way in the Naval at Annapolis, there's a good chance I might be sitting on a boat or in a submarine, and I had no interest in that whatsoever. So I was like, yeah, you know what? That sounds cool and all, but I'm going to go over to this Air Force thing. So I went to pilot training, went to fixed wing pilot training. And then when I got out of there, it was the early 90s, which they had more fighter pilots than they needed, and they were short helicopter pilots. And so I was not offered a fighter. There actually was a guy in my class. We had one fighter offered, and the guy in my class absolutely deserved it. The guy's a rock star. He's a test pilot for like General Dynamics or Northrop or something now. And so all the rest of us were sitting here going, well, what are we going to do? And the helicopter kind of piqued my fancy. It was a Huey, and I was like, yeah, this it seems closer to a fighter than a C-130 or a C-5, and I didn't have a real plan B, so the helicopter became my plan B. And then once I got in, I loved it. I loved working with crews. And then when I was going to aircraft commander training, they said, you might want to consider going to the MH-53s. I was like, what's that? And started me down that path. And I could not have happened better. I've always said my greatest successes have always been in spite of my best efforts. And that was definitely one of them. So. Yeah.
That's awesome. I was inspired by Top Gun as well back then, and I really wanted to join the Navy and be a fighter pilot. And I started talking to people, and they're like, "You got to do a lot of math." And I said, "Well, how about the Army? I think I'll do that instead." And I think the next question here, it could be a podcast all in its own, right? It's probably hard to sum up, but what about I know what being a Ranger taught me about life and leadership and parenting and everything. What did being a pilot in the Air Force kind of teach you about life as a whole?
Yeah. That's that's a great question. And you're right. We could probably spend a while on it, but I know you want to keep your listeners interested. So I'm going to try and boil it down to two things. One is know the threat. And that was actually placed into words for me by an A-10 buddy of mine. And when we were on staff, and it's kind of becomes intrinsic being a helicopter pilot because stuff's always going to go wrong. I mean, it's just the nature of helicopters. Like you were saying, the leaks and stuff, if it's leaking, that's great. Just let me know when it stops, because then we've got a problem because we're out of fluid, right? Yeah. So the first thing is know the threat. And then the kind of the sub part of that first thing is, and be prepared for it, right? So if you're constantly looking out for what's Murphy got lined up for me, and you're prepared for that, then it's not as big a deal, and you just get comfortable operating that. And I know that's the case for the Rangers. When we were doing our kind of sound thing, they were talking about PACE, right? Primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. That's kind of a thing for life. Hey, this is my primary plan. It's my alternate plan. Okay, and then if that doesn't work, I got a contingency, and then I really got an emergency. So that, I think being a helicopter pilot got me into that habit and that mindset. And so whenever life comes at you with changes, I always kind of have that PACE plan out there. And what's the threat? What's the next thing that could possibly bite me? And then how do I deal with that? Yeah. And then the second lesson that I learned was you cannot do that alone. Be that your family, your friends, your teammates, your crew members, your squadron mates, they are all valuable assets. And so if the sooner you realize that you're not in it alone, I think that sets you up better for dealing with whatever the threat is when it comes at you, but then also the resiliency piece if things don't necessarily go your way. If you know that you have resources out there, and already in advance that you can't go along, it makes it easier to seek help. Yeah. And that's I use help. I seek help not only when things are down, but when they're good, because I'm always constantly being like, all right, what am I not seeing here? What could things go differently? I think that's kind of one of the pilot things we do is we brief things threat forward. Even the airlines do that. We call it threat forward briefing. We talk about what are the threats, how are we going to mitigate that? And now what can we use? What resources do we have to mitigate that? So it carries through in life as well. And it's, that's generally the kind of the two rules I get out of that, or two big lessons out of that.
Yeah. I think, my military experience, being in combat and doing everything I did in the Army, I realize now that when on the other side of the uniform, when a problem presents itself, I'm able to slow down and really analyze the situation. Instead of where I've seen some people who haven't had experience like that, they tend to speed up when things get harder and actually create more problems. Is that kind of the same thing when you have a warning light go off in your helicopter? Instead of panicking, you just kind of take a step back and look at it from a different perspective?
That's exactly right. Matter of fact, I used to brief when I still do. I say, hey, no fast hands in the cockpit, right? There's no gunslingers. There's no reason. And I think that the SEALs have that saying, it's slow is smooth, smooth is fast, right? And it really helps. We actually, in pilot training, when you're going through undergraduate pilot training, one of the things they do when they say, okay, you're flying along and you hear a loud bang. What do you do? Okay, first thing I do, hack the clock. Now, why do I hack the clock? Honestly, it doesn't matter if you hack the clock or not. The physical action of hacking the clock, you don't care what time it is. But what you're trying to do is you're giving yourself that opportunity to take a breath. So by hacking the clock, you're forcing, the muscle and everything to click, and now you get yourself in that crisis management mindset. All right, clock's hacked. Now what do we do? Aviate. All right, keep the aircraft upright. That's the first thing we're going to do. All right. As long as the aircraft's upright and it's flying, now I'm gonna start looking around and seeing what's going on, and then navigate's the next part, and then communicate. So aviate, navigate, communicate, and then the sub piece of the aviate is analyze the situation, take appropriate action. All right. So what's going on? What's hitting me up here? And so it's a very deliberate piece, and then analyze the situation, take appropriate action, and then take whatever steps you need to do, and then clean up the rest of the issue. So whatever the EP or emergency is. So we do all those things, and by following that step-by-step process, you can do that in life too. So anything's going weird, hack the clock, take a breath, slow down. Let's see what's going on. And you're absolutely right. I can see that. You see guys people that don't have that practice, and you're right, they'll speed up, and it's like, okay, and it kind of makes me nervous actually watching people do that. I don't know about you. Yeah. When I see people start to come apart, I'm like, okay, let's just take a breath.
Yeah.
There are very few things that need immediate response.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's great advice for, military life, parenting, everything. So
parenting too. Yeah, absolutely.
So you did a full career in the military, and as the military it goes in ebbs and flows in seasons, right? Things change.
The
military as a whole is kind of in a season of change, right? We're coming out of Afghanistan, trying to find our legs on what's next. And there's a lot of people out there, both pilots, Rangers, SEALs, are kind of wondering, hey, is this what I want to do for my career? What kept you in for 20 years, or what would you say to somebody that was really, at a point in their career where they're deciding whether to step out of uniform or stay in and continue to serve?
Yeah. I think the big things that kept me in the military was the mission and the people. I love the mission that we were doing. I love the people that I was serving with. And I was constantly being presented with opportunities to make an impact. So I got, and actually that's kind of right around the point in time when I decided to retire as well, was I kind of hit my opus, or as far as being able to make impacts in stuff that I felt that I could really do a unique impact. And then I started looking ahead, and I knew that I was kind of maybe interested in going to the airlines, but not really, to be honest. So I just knew that was kind of that was actually like my plan B, getting out. But I knew that there's a certain age that you can't stay in forever. And if you can't not stay in forever, and you have a path, that there's a destination out there somewhere, well, at a certain point in time, it's time to get off the train and start going towards that. And but for the first 20, 21 years I was in, I was constantly in a great mission. The payload was awesome. Taking guys like you to work all the time was just because it's the opportunity to work with the number one best pipe hitters in the world. I hopefully the term pipe hitter doesn't turn off your front of the tip of the spear kind of guys, but they're. And that's one of the things that I really learned about the Rangers too, because, I think most people think when they hear Ranger, if they're uneducated, they think, these guys are a bunch of knuckle draggers. They're kind of a bunch of pit bulls that you kind of cut loose. And I'm like, no, actually they are really smart and really good at what they are. And the number one light infantry in the entire world. And so the opportunity to work with those guys, you guys, you haven't lived until you've seen a Ranger briefing, and it's like, holy cow, that is impressive, and the ability, the rock drills, and the ability to run through all that stuff is just amazing. So the fact that I got to work with the Rangers and the SEALs and the national mission guys, just unbelievable, and so I loved it. And I was just like a pig in mud. I was like, this is where I was meant to be. It was a lot of fun. And and you're constantly elevated. When you're around guys that are operating at such a high level, then you're forced to raise yourself. So that is just fantastic. And then I kept getting presented with more opportunities to make more of an impact. And so I kept doing that. And then once I got to a point, I was like, okay, what's next? And when the what's next wasn't as clear as I wanted it to be, and I knew that at some point I was going to have to leave you got to hang up your spurs at some point. That's when I said, okay, it's good. And I left very happy and very fulfilled. So,
yeah. I agree. If you probably would have asked me the same question 5 years ago, I would have said the mission was why I was staying, because I loved going there. But now, in retrospect, it's the people 100%.
yep.
And it wasn't the people; it was the people in the Ranger Regiment, but it was also the people like you and the 160th and the other tiers. And like you said,
Yep.
just knowing that you have to show up your best every day, because you're going to go bang out this target, but this pilot's going to put you down in Nangarhar on an HLZ the size of a postage stamp, and you don't know how the hell he's going to do it, and you hope he can do it. But just being around people like that every day is it's unique. If you haven't been there, it's hard to understand. And I just tell people that if you're thinking about getting out, just make sure you have that deliberate conversation with yourself and realize you're not just giving up the job, you're giving up being around amazing high performers every single day. So good stuff. So you transitioned, it's been a couple years since you transitioned from service. Looking back on it, would you have changed anything about your transition? Did you learn any hard lessons in there, or something that you'd pass on to somebody who's kind of might be doing that right now?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question, and I like the term hard lesson. And something you just said when you were talking about cautioning guys, that is very true, and something that I actually almost got out right around September of 2001, which is kind of significant. I actually signed my extension paperwork on September 9th.
Oh, wow.
And mailed it in on the 10th. And part of the reason I chose, obviously we didn't know 9/11 was going to happen. It hadn't happened yet. But I was like, I'm still having a good time, and I love the people I'm with. So, it wasn't like, we were in peace, kind of, we'd done Bosnia and Kosovo, but still there wasn't really that much going on. I'm so glad I stayed in now, obviously. But yeah, if a guy's thinking about getting out, they really need to kind of take a long look and say, okay, don't just get out because maybe you're like, hey, this isn't the way I like it. Don't forget you're leaving your family, because you really are truly leaving your family. So getting to the meat of your question, is there any lessons learned? I think one thing is that probably the thing that was most difficult for me was leaving my military family. And I think you just have to mentally prepare yourself for that. You do. There's no way around it. Even if you're fortunate enough, like I was fortunate enough to actually stay as a contractor. I actually got to do literally the same mission I'd been doing. Same task force and everything, just as a civilian. So I was kind of able to like slowly get out of the pool, right? As opposed to just jumping completely out. But it was still hard. It was still hard because you're still no longer in uniform. So I would say one, very much mentally prepare yourself that you are going to leave you're going to leave your military family behind. And so what does that mean? And then the other piece is kind of have a clear vision of who you want to be once you get out. So for me, I was like, yeah, I'm just going to kind of wade through there. And I was very lucky and very fortunate because we actually stayed local. So I still had my friends and we get together. And I would recommend that. I would say if you can still have a group of veteran friends, or even maybe they're not your current friends, or maybe you're going to a place, think about joining the VFW, something along those lines, or a veterans group, a veterans charity, something like that definitely helps. And I still do stuff like that today. We still do, I think you've talked to Shed, so you know about what we were doing with the Jumpstart Your Wife for veterans. Those kind of things are nice to do because it still keeps you connected to that group of people, that veteran community. So that was difficult leaving the military family. And then the other piece that was kind of, I got to say, I was pretty fortunate with the fact that I am an aviator. I kind of knew that I could go to the aviation background, but civilian aviation is different. And I was fortunate enough to have mentors that had already made the jump and And so they kind of were able to prepare me for what was coming up. And so I would definitely say that I'm glad I had those mentors and that I had reached out to people before I got out and what's this going to look like when I get out. So I'd say probably the biggest lesson learned is it's harder than you think. But the other side of that is it's still doable. It's fine. And then probably maybe, yeah, I'd say my wife she's stronger than I am. So she probably actually did better than I did as far as the transition goes. But
yeah, I got one of those wives too, who's definitely doing
yeah,
better in the transition.
there you go.
It is a big, it's a void, right? When you leave, because I mean, coming from places, access is stripped. You're in a lot of. I don't have my badge anymore. I'm not walking into the building. I'm not going to the meetings. It's difficult, but I think you got to just find mentorship, right? People that came from where you are and are where you want to be, hopefully, so you can talk to them. I do this podcast for therapy. It's for me to talk. It's to talk to guys like you and other service members and people. You got to find your team on the other side of the uniform. I think to help you get through it. When I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, I'm just curious about one of the quotes in there. It says to find and feed the spark in us so that together we can lead our own legacy. I'm just curious what that means.
Yeah, so that is actually my why. And anyone that's familiar with Simon Sinek and the book Start with Why, that's my why. And it's that thing, that intrinsic thing that we have the difficulty putting words to, that are why we're here on this planet. And there's a saying that says, hey, look, the two most important times in your life are one, when you're born, and two, when you discover why you're born. Well, mine was to find and feed the spark in us so that we can each lead our own legacy. So I happen to be, and this kind of goes to my how, is I'm really good at connecting dots. So I'm good at seeing where there's a need and a requirement with someone that has that strength. And what I get my greatest fulfillment out of is when I see someone that has a very that has a capacity or an ability, or that they have their own why that is pointed towards a certain target. What I get my fulfillment out of is taking that, whatever it is, and giving a vector to that so that it winds up on the target. So one of my most fulfilling opportunities when I was in active duty was I was able to stand up both the MH-53 weapons school and the U-28 weapons school. And those are, the Air Force weapons schools, like Top Gun, basically. As a matter of fact, Top Gun was kind of modeled after it. So the opportunity to, particularly for the U-28, was I was able to I wasn't able to pick my team because wing commanders do that, but I was able to give the wing commander the list of guys who I wanted him to choose from. And he was a great guy, and he picked the guys that I really wanted. So because I saw in those guys, I was like, these are the guys that are going to make the most impact and going to do the greatest job at standing this up. And so that is kind of whenever I see someone that's got that spark, whatever it is, I like to feed that spark, grow it, and then fire it at the target, because that's why I was put here. So that's what that means.
Yeah, and what would you say, or advice would you give somebody who has lost the spark, right? They can't find it. It's gone out. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I would. One of the things is, and this is not really meant to be a book endorsement or anything, but that book, Start with Why, is a really good first place to start. We do Jumpstart Your Why for veterans. And if you go with startwithwhy.com, I think it kind of talks about what that is. Even if it's not for veterans, they do those things all the time. Yeah. I like the veterans one because it's all of us. It's all people who have the same kind of thing. And the way that we go through that process is it's actually about telling stories. Because the funny thing about the why, your personal why, is that comes from the limbic part of the brain, which has no capacity for speech. But it's where your emotions and your decision making comes from. That's why when people go, why'd you do this? Well, it came from my gut. Well, your gut's really your limbic brain. And it doesn't have a capacity for speech. So, but what it can do is it can communicate through telling stories. So when we do that find your why kind of thing, that spark, we do that by telling someone who you don't necessarily know. Actually, you don't really want to know them very well. Stories that are very important and impactful to you in life. And by looking at certain themes in those stories, we can start to tease out what's important to that person. And then we can put words to the why that way. So that is kind of the process. So I would say that if you're trying to do this on your own, because like I said, I'm not trying to do an endorsement for any sort of thing. It worked well for me. And that's actually one of the things I did when I got out that helped me. So you're actually, the other thing you were saying about what was one of the things, a lesson learned. What actually, for me, one of my lessons learned was I probably should have done that why discovery way before. And actually, Shed's the guy who I did my why discovery with. But it was probably would have been good to do that like right before I got out, because then I would have had a kind of a career, a better, clear focus on what I wanted to do, as opposed to just kind of stumbling along and figuring it out. And the irony is I actually already knew Simon. I'd known Simon for a couple of years before I got out. So I'd known him this whole time, and here's this great resource. I didn't really think about doing the why discovery, but yeah.
I agree 100%. I did the Start With Why stuff with the Honor Foundation
Awesome.
when I went through there.
Oh yeah, okay, great.
Talk about starting in vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
And then the power of telling your own story helped uncover my why. It was an amazing experience. I would recommend it to anybody, especially somebody that's in transition, because it's transition into the civilian world's hard, and translating what you did is hard, and all that process helped me do all of that. It was I would recommend it for anybody. It was like you said, it's probably the best thing I did, and before transitioning, to really kind of help me understand myself. Cultivate that emotional intelligence. It was an amazing thing.
Oh, fantastic! Fantastic.
We'll bring the plane in to land here a little bit, but I'm just curious if you could look back, all the way to that Air Force cadet and give a piece of advice, about your military career, or even as a husband and a father. What advice would you give him?
I would say one is have a plan. So take a look and sit down in a quiet place. Maybe talk to some mentors. I would start out with that why discovery. Now that's a great resource. Now, from the why discovery, sit down and look at where you want to be in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Because, and actually, I'm going to back up one more. Write down your values. Write down what's important to you, and refer to those often. That becomes your North Star. If you always are, and then when you come up to a crossroads and a decision, you can always refer back to those values. So write down seriously what's important to you, what your values are. And also that will help you when you come to a point in time when you're being asked to compromise one of those. You can remind yourself, nope, that's not something we're going to do. So those are kind of your guardrails and your North Star. Then you get your why discovery, and then from there you've got your plan, your 1, 5, 10, 20-year plan on where you want to be. And then the third thing is grow where you're planted. So you may have a vision. I am not where I thought I was going to be in 20 years at any point. It's always I was getting these crossroads presented to me. And for me, I was fortunate enough and blessed enough to have people that would say, hey, this is actually where you need to go. And so I had a bit of faith there that, okay, this is, like I said, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. And that was not where my greatest impact would have been. So you have to have a certain amount of faith in that. Hey, look, even if the plan doesn't go according to plan, you adapt and you execute, and then you figure out where you can best serve there. And that's really where the fulfillment for all of us is. And if you look at everyone's why, it's always involving other people.
Right.
It's, again, like I said, way back in the beginning of this conversation, you can't do this alone. And ironically, your greatest fulfillment is going to be from figuring out how you can make the greatest contribution and serving others. And that's like, when I look back on my career, my greatest successes have always been in the service of other people. And I think that's what we were put on this planet to do. So, have that plan. When it doesn't go your way, make sure that you're still following your values. As long as you're following your values, grow where you're planted, and the results will astonish you and be extremely fulfilling.
I couldn't agree more. That's true. Everything you said there, there's some of those. I just wish I'd have done it 10 years earlier in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
Hindsight will get you 100% of the time. It's undefeated. Hindsight is so.
It is.
Paul, I appreciate you coming on here, sharing your story. Thanks for your service. Thanks for flying us around the friendly skies up there nowadays. It's awesome. This is just an awesome conversation that I hope everybody listens to that's in a season of especially of transition or interested in going to the Air Force Academy. Even though the new Top Gun is out, if you don't make it, you're going to find yourself on a submarine, which sounds like the worst place on earth for me to be for 6 months.
Yeah, I would have been out. Yeah.
But thank you, and everybody out there listening. Make sure you do everything like, share, subscribe, and we'll catch everybody on the next episode. Thanks again, Paul.
Hey, thanks, Jim. I appreciate it, man.